Today we're going to be looking at a pretty gruesome case that took place in a town called Stellenbosch here in South Africa. Cases like this tend to get a lot of attention here because homicides are usually a result of robberies, hijackings and petty crime. So this case, which didn't involve any of those, received a great deal of media attention. The Van Bredas were a pretty well-off family that lived in an upmarket golf estate called De in Stellenbosch, a wine region about an hour from Cape Town. The estate had 24-hour guard patrol, alarm systems, access-controlled gates, motion detectors, and an electric fence that spanned the perimeter. The family was made up by Martin and Teresa Van Breda and their children, Rudy, the oldest son, who was 22, Henry, who was 20, and Madly, the youngest and only daughter, who was 16 years old. They had recently moved back after living in Melbourne, Australia for almost 8 years. They seemed like a pretty normal family from the outside, and were described by Martin's business associates as a lovely family, and the children were said to be awesome and respectful. Rudy was a keen sportsman and was highly regarded amongst his peers as a good-natured and friendly person. Teresa was described as very loving and invested in the lives of her children, while Martin was said to be a kind and entrepreneurial man who was always a hard worker. So what happened was just all the more shocking and devastating to the community.
What is your emergency?
I need an ambulance. Lots of
The ambulance.
Yes, please.
What's your name, sir?
Henry from Breda.
And you, the patient.
No, my family is someone attacked my family.
Now, who is injured?
I think everyone.
Everyone in your house.
Everyone, 4 people, yes.
What are the injuries?
Head injuries.
Are they conscious?
I don't think so. My sister's moving, but that's it.
Are there any suspects on scene?
No, they ran away.
With what were they attacked?
An axe.
And you need the ambulance to go to what?
Number 12, Hosker Street.
POS.
KE.
Unconscious, huh?
Yes, and bleeding from the head, please. How long will the ambulance take?
It won't be too long. They'll send the ambulance out as soon as possible.
On the 27th of January 2015, paramedics received a call in the early hours of the morning, explaining that there'd been a home invasion. First responders arrived to a horrific scene. A now retired officer who was on the scene said blood ran like a waterfall down the stairs. The responders soon found the bodies of Martin and Rudy in the bedroom on the first floor. 16-year-old Madly, who showed very similar injuries to those sustained by her already deceased family members, was by some miracle still alive. However, her condition was extremely severe, and she was fighting for her life. The extent of the injuries on the family made it clear that the assailant intended to kill, and had moved very quickly and with determination. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was intentional. The only one relatively unscathed after the horrific attack was Henry Van Breda, the middle child of the family. He gives a statement to the police on the scene, describing a large, well-built black man as the intruder. He claims that the assailant broke into the family home, wearing gloves and a balaclava, and wielding an axe. He also claimed to have tried to wrestle the intruder, which is what resulted in him being stabbed in the torso with a knife. There were no signs of forced entry to the Van Breda home. No items were removed from the home, and no intruder to the estate was detected by the security company during the period. Initially, his version of events had seemed plausible. Things like this do happen in South Africa all the time, and he had even sustained minor lacerations and a shallow stab wound. But these were in stark contrast to the gruesome head wounds sustained by the rest of his family. Why had Henry managed to escape relatively unscathed, while his whole family had been systematically slaughtered one by one? Things weren't really looking very good for the last standing Van Breda, as police quickly started to question the 20-year-old story. It was well known that the estate was extremely secure, and that breaking in would come at a major cost to what would likely be a petty thief, not to mention breaking back out of the estate without being noticed by a guard, or captured on CCTV after all the commotion. The community started to wonder what exactly happened that night. Why did a close-knit family with no enemies end up in such a horrific situation? 2 weeks into the investigation on February 8th, news broke that Henry was a suspect in the murders, as evidence showed that he only called paramedics approximately 4 hours after the attack. Now, as any of us non-murdering people know, if you experience a horrific break-in that results in your entire family needing urgent medical care, you're not going to be dilly-dallying and having a cup of tea, taking your sweet time while they bleed out. especially if there's still a chance that one might be able to be saved. You'd be calling the paramedics immediately and likely shouting out to neighbors for help as soon as the coast was clear. It was also revealed that his wound showed signs of being self-inflicted, which doesn't come as a surprise considering that almost his whole family was dead, while he only had a few minor lacerations to his torso. On February 15th, reports started to emerge that Henry was a drug addict, and that his allowance had been cut off out of concern by his parents. A drug runner had been able to positively identify Henry as a regular customer, who mostly bought tuk, which is what South Africans call meth. As many know, meth doesn't exactly have a calming effect on a person. In fact, it has been linked time and time again to aggression and violent episodes. Further claims stated that Henry had spent time at an upmarket rehabilitation centre in Cape Town a year or so prior to the attacks. These allegations were rejected by his aunt, and despite speculation, his girlfriend Danielle Janse van Rensburg, who had met him after the murders, said she believed in his innocence 100%.
Did you ever say to Henry, "Did you do this?"
No. Not
You never
like
said
that.
to him, "Tell me, look me in the eye, that you didn't do this, you didn't murder your family"?
I did not do that to him, no. Knowing how unable he is to hurt anything. He doesn't like seeing anybody or anything in pain. He honestly, he will rather be in pain just to help someone else out. He is very selfless. Nothing made me think that it doesn't add up. His story still always made sense to me with the lack of evidence.
On the 10th of March, after nearly 6 weeks of intensive medical treatment, Madly was released from the hospital. She had sustained a severe head injury and suffered from retrograde amnesia due to the sheer trauma of the attack, meaning that she has no memories of any of the details of the attack. Police continue to investigate while keeping a close eye on Henry, who still appeared to be the only suspect despite his remaining family disputing these claims. In June, several months after the attack, Madly returned to school and was said to be doing very well. She also saw Henry for the first time since the attack, and was apparently happy to see her older brother. News on Madly has since been closely guarded due to a court order to respect her privacy as a minor. The following year, on the 13th of June, almost a year and a half since the brutal attack, Henry hands himself over to the police after finding out that his arrest was imminent, and that he was being charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder.
Henry, turn around! Henry!
The following day, he appeared in the Stellenbosch Magistrates Court, and was released on a bail of 100,000 rand, which is around $7,000, on the condition that he followed a strict set of rules, including handing over travel documents, not communicating with any state witnesses, and remaining in the vicinity of the Western Cape, among others. 3 days before he appeared in the Western Cape High Court for a pre-trial hearing, Henry and his girlfriend are arrested for cannabis possession. When Henry does appear in court on the 9th of September, 2 briefcases are stolen from the vehicle of his attorney, and the trial is postponed. On the 19th of October, he appears in the Cape Town High Court with his girlfriend for the cannabis charges, and both are allowed out on bail. The trial officially starts in April 2017, over 2 years since the attack. Henry pleads not guilty and during testimony describes his recollection of events. He claims that him and the family were attacked by an axe-wielding black man, wearing dark clothes, gloves, and a balaclava-type mask. Henry says that the assailant, whose silhouette he saw from the toilet door, was busy attacking Rudy, when his father Martin switched on the lights of the room and ran to the aid of his son. He then says that Martin was also hit over the head by the attacker, who Henry says was laughing as he attacked him. Following this, Teresa asks what the commotion was, and Henry says he can't recall what happened next, as he didn't see the attack on his mother as they were now outside his field of vision. Henry says that the attacker came towards him, and he managed to remove the axe from the assailant, who then came at him with a knife. Henry says that it was during the scuffle that he sustained his injuries. The attacker fled the room with Henry supposedly in pursuit, and he sees Madly and his mother lying outside the bedroom door. Henry then throws the axe at the attacker, loses his footing and falls down the stairs, but gets up to follow the attacker towards the kitchen and out the back door. At this point he states that the attacker's left, and he called his girlfriend at the time, Bianca. When questioned as to why he doesn't call emergency services, he states that he simply didn't have their number. I mean, your family is dead and dying in your house and you don't try to Google the number, or run to a neighbor or shout for help? The court actually later found a note on the fridge door that contained an emergency contact list that the parents had left if the kids ever needed it. Things are not looking so good for Henry at this point. Henry apparently then goes back inside, where he loses consciousness on the stairs and loses track of time. He is unable to state whether he loses consciousness due to shock or due to the extent of his injuries. Once he awakens, he Googles an emergency services number and smokes 3 cigarettes. The court then examines every aspect of the security system of the estate, including the integrity of the perimeter, CCTV footage, emergency protocol, and access records, which showed that no one entered the estate from 11:07 to 7:05 the following morning. During cross-examination, Henry himself even agreed that it was a fair assessment to make that possible intruders had to go to an enormous amount of trouble to get into the estate, which was surrounded by an electrified fence. Considering that no belongings were taken, there seems like a great deal of trouble to go to. The emergency call and Henry's demeanour are also called into question by the court. Henry states that he immediately went and phoned the emergency services again after regaining consciousness. This is found to be untrue, as according to phone records, Henry never phoned the emergency services before he lost consciousness. He did do an internet search for an ambulance at 4:27 a.m, but only attempted to phone emergency services from his mobile phone for the first time at 7:12. The call controller, who was called as a witness, even says that she thought it might be a prank call, simply due to the calm and cooperative nature of Henry's behaviour during a 25-minute-long phone call. I think we can all safely say that we would have a hard time remaining calm on a 25-minute-long phone call when your family is bleeding out next to you. She also states that he didn't at any point ask how he could help the victims. Henry's defense when his calm manner was called into question was that he struggled with a speech impediment, and speaking slowly was his way of working around it. The court agreed that his stutter could be identified in the recording, but the call controller stated that the lack of urgency and Henry's demeanour during a disturbing and unduly long phone conversation with emergency services seemed to be highly unusual for a supposedly traumatized victim. In Henry's description of the night, the attack happened not long before 4:24 a.m. on the morning of the 27th of January, 2015. Their next-door neighbour testified that she heard loud male voices with an aggressive undertone from the Van Breda residence on the night of the murders, from 10 till about 10 past midnight. The sound of the baby monitor for her son woke her up at around 4 a.m. She found it strange that both her sons were awake at 4 a.m. that morning, as her eldest son never woke up through the night. Taking into consideration the testimony from the neighbour, the incident probably took place at around 4 to 4:24 a.m. on the 27th of January. Henry attempted to contact emergency services for help at 7:12 for the first time. In other words, approximately 2 hours and 48 minutes later. The question is what transpired during that time. During this period, Henry claims to have smoked at least 3 cigarettes at the kitchen counter. He smoked the cigarettes one after the other, and evidence showed that the butts were found on the floor close to the kitchen counter. After trying to Google the emergency services number while smoking, Henry then claims to have lost consciousness on the middle landing of the stairs. He says that once he regained consciousness, he was confused, but after seeing Mudley, he supposedly snapped back into consciousness. Doctors testified that it could be the result of a head injury, but that it was suspicious that he was fully oriented later that day upon meeting the doctor, and that he showed no signs of concussion or brain injury. Another doctor then testified that 90% of people suffering from concussion don't lose consciousness, and if one does so for more than a minute, then serious brain injuries are to be expected. So even if he was mildly concussed, it would not result in a loss of consciousness for several hours. Furthermore, she says that him being able to Google emergency services numbers shows that he was not confused enough to have sustained an injury so serious that he would lose consciousness for several hours. The court then goes on to examine the scene of the crime and the demeanour of Henry.
Like total calm. You would expect all that rage and stuff inside, but there was nothing. He was just calm.
The police officer who arrived noted that the door was slightly ajar, and that Henry had come out of the house with grey sleeping shorts and white socks. He had minor injuries and dry blood on his body. Blood splatter could be seen on his shorts. He appeared nervous, scared, emotional, and panic-stricken, with a slight tremble, so they treated him as a victim.
But when he's telling you this story, are you thinking to yourself, wow?
Is it possibly true? Can it be what he's telling me? Can it be the truth? Well, to me personally, I said to myself, no, this can't be.
You knew.
I knew this can't be. But I can't just say to you, no, you are lying. I have to prove it.
Henry told the officer that his family was attacked with an axe, so they went in to investigate the scene while Henry sat outside and was tended to by the paramedics. They realized that Madly was still alive, and she was rushed to the hospital. South African police services testified that the crime scene was not consistent with a house robbery or a burglary. Sergeant Kleinhans, with 20 years of service, testified that the appearance of the ground floor did not give the impression of a burglary or crime scene. The house was not in disarray, and items of value were not taken. It is clear from the crime scene photographs that items of value were well within view of anyone entering or exiting the house. The items were easily accessible and portable.
This is the entrance of the Van Breda home, and immediately as you enter the home, there is a dining room table which had a laptop, and I've tagged the laptop, and it had a handbag on it. The handbag was actually open and not really disturbed, and nothing was removed from the handbag. We know that nothing was removed from the house that evening, but what is surprising, and Kleinhans confirmed this, is that if there were intruders, if we believe Henry's version, it's strange that they wouldn't even take something as easily accessible as a handbag sitting on a table that if they'd entered from the front entrance, they would have bypassed. And even if they'd exited, this is the stairs which Henry alleged they ran down, or one of the attackers ran down, they would have gone past this handbag to exit out the kitchen door. So it was certainly in the path of the alleged intruders, as Henry has said. Another aspect with regards to having an intruder fleeing the scene is that there were 2 luxury motor vehicles in the garage, which the intruders elected not to use when they fled the scene.
Captain Nicholas Steyn, with 28 years of service, also testified that the profile of the crime scene did not correspond with other robbery crime scenes. The scene was not turned upside down, and there were no signs of forced entry. Captain Steyn testified that it appeared strange to him that electronic appliances, cell phones, laptops, purses and wallets were all left behind in the house by possible intruders. Henry's defense suggested that a balaclava gang was involved in the commission of the crimes, as such a gang was operating in the Stellenbosch area. Captain Steyn was part of a task team established to investigate a spate of house robberies by the balaclava gang. The balaclava gang targeted isolated or freestanding houses, for example farms and freeholdings on the outskirts of the town. The balaclava gang only once targeted a house in a populated area, situated some distance from other houses. The Van Breda home was almost in the middle of the estate, and there were houses in very close proximity. It was a pretty built-up area. Captain Steyn testified that the project lasted from June 2014 until August 2015. The members of the balaclava gang were arrested. They were charged with 10 matters, and their DNA was linked to various crime scenes. With the previous 50 to 60 crime scenes that the task team investigated, the intention of the perpetrators was robbery and theft. All movable items of value, for example jewelry, televisions and laptops, were all stolen. So the theory didn't really line up with the Van Breda crime scene at all, where absolutely nothing was taken, and there were no signs of forced entry. During the court proceedings, Henry became emotional from time to time. For example, when clips of the emergency recording were played in court and during the testimony of the pathologist. It is expected that it would be emotional to relive the traumatic events, and his reaction was not unusual in the circumstances. During his testimony, Henry appeared to be uncomfortable at times, and at other times he appeared oddly confident. On a question whether he was the only person alive that could remember what transpired the night of the murders, he almost sarcastically responded that he had no idea what the attacker's memory was like. He would make statements like, "We made every effort to minimize my exposure to those photos." At one point, he wanted to clarify what his counsel was objecting to. What struck the court was that he didn't show a great deal of emotion, even when he demonstrated the blows when the attacker hit Rudy and his father, as well as the altercation between himself and the attacker.
He sort of spun away. His arm went across here a couple of times to cut me there, so I moved my arm away and went across each time I was avoiding the other arm. And then I started and just get out of the way. And then about there is where I struck both arms. Yes. He let go and basically started retreating. I
The axe used to commit the murders was noted as looking new, and lab reports showed that the DNA of most of the family was found on the weapon. Following testimony from one of Madeli's friends and the Van Breda housekeeper, it was also concluded that the axe belonged to the family.
In the kitchen there was the drawers that were opened on this side, and they were the drawers which contained the knives. And the pantry where the household axe was kept was over here, near the kitchen back door where we believe the intruders exited.
The housekeeper stated it had been kept in the same place in the pantry behind the ironing board since she started working for the family in October 2014. A knife was also found at the scene, partly hidden under Rudy's bed. Henry alleged that an intruder had stabbed him with a knife. He also testified that the attacker recovered fairly quickly after being disarmed, and came back at him with a knife in his right hand. He claims to not have seen where the knife came from. He said that he pulled the knife out of his side and dropped it, presumably somewhere on the floor in the first bedroom. The housekeeper again testified that the knife looked the same as the set of the knives kept in the drawer where the spoons are in the kitchen. She testified that both the axe and the knife looked the same as the ones that were kept in the Van Breda residence. Furthermore, on investigating the scene, it was found that the drawer where the knives were kept was slightly open. Henry confirmed that the knife resembled their kitchen knives, and agreed that the knife came from their kitchen. He also confirmed that the knives were kept in the top drawer, and the kitchen appeared to be undisturbed except for the two drawers in the same location. The court also questioned that an axe would be a really peculiar choice of a weapon for a burglar or thief to take along to an intended crime scene. Before the attack, the Van Breda family were presumably all asleep, except for Henry, who was in the ensuite bathroom of the first bedroom. He didn't hear the intruders inside the house before the attack on his brother. There was no risk of identifying the balaclava-wearing intruder, and therefore no reason for the intruder, with the intention of stealing, to wipe out almost an entire family, who were in any case oblivious to the presence of the intruder.
If one has regard to the fact that you appear to agree that both Exhibit 1 and 2, both the axe and the knife, are from your house, it would then imply, logically, that whoever approached your house that night came either unarmed or armed inadequately.
That's logical.
Sorry?
That's logical.
Because someone, one or more persons from this group saw the necessity or the need to arm themselves with weapons from the house.
The opportunity, yes.
Sorry?
Yes, I agree.
You said something about an opportunity.
Say replace the need with opportunity, but other than that, I don't disagree.
It would be strange had a person planned to enter your house and attack the family that they come armed inadequately or unarmed.
Yes, yeah, that's logical.
So they were in actual fact being still prepared for the whole excursion.
It would seem so.
The alternative is, if, as has been suggested, possibly the axe or the knife does not come from the house, difficult to understand why they would then leave it on the house and expose them to possibly being traced.
Correct.
Is it also difficult to understand in your version, so how the one person who you saw moved up to the upstairs level was also the one person who is armed with weaponry that was obtained in the house?
Repeat the question, sorry.
According to your version, sir, which you said you only saw one person as far as you can remember, and the attacks all took place at the top floor.
Yes.
The one person that you saw that came upstairs is also incidentally the same person who is armed with both the axe and the knife that comes from the house.
Correct.
It's not as if he is one of
do find that strange.
If the intention of the intruder was to kill the occupants of the house, it would be senseless not to bring a weapon along. The alleged intruder clearly planned the commission of the crimes by wearing gloves, dark clothes, and a balaclava mask. So why no weapon? Laughing whilst attacking family members also appears to be a very strange behaviour for a random assailant with no personal ties to the family. The degree of violence displayed towards the deceased victims and Madly seems to be excessive. All the deceased and Madly had several wounds directed at the parts of the human body with a very high mortality rate, according to medical opinion. The attack on Henry was certainly not launched with the same intensity as those on the other family members. When questioned why he didn't have potentially fatal wounds, Henry conceded that the attack on him was more restrained compared to that of the rest of the family. The court also found it strange that there were no sign of the family having any enemies, or being involved in any sketchy business dealings. All testimony pointed to the Van Bredas being a normal family with normal family issues. No one can think of anyone that would have a grudge against them, or any sort of reason to want to cause them harm. WhatsApp communication between the accused and his girlfriend, as well as Madly and her ex-boyfriend, indicated that there were no major unresolved issues before or after 10 o'clock that night. The neighbour who overheard the commotion between 10 and 12 said that the loud voices were so disturbing that they actually gave her a fright. Henry's defence claimed that they had watched the movie Star Trek II Into Darkness. It was suggested that the movie had been approximately 2 hours long, and that was what the neighbour had heard between 10 and midnight the night of the murders. She was adamant that she did not hear a movie with music and a soundtrack, and testified that she was familiar with the Star Trek theme song. Madly's ex-boyfriend testified about a heated argument between the family members at some stage that upset Madly and Teresa to such an extent that the witness actually said to Madly that he wanted to murder the family around her. He said that he was concerned about the reason why Teresa got so upset, and he felt that there might have been something more to the argument than was let on. Rudy had extensive scalp lacerations and injuries to the brain, consisting of 7 wounds. The wounds were located more towards the left side and back of the head. He also had 3 minor blunt force trauma wounds to the leg and wrist. One was a defensive wound, a small incised wound on the left little finger, and another was a loose nail on the left little finger. Dr. Anthony, who was called in to testify in court, concluded that a severe skull fracture caused damage to the brain itself and contributed to his death, together with a large amount of blood loss. 5 wounds in themselves could be fatal, and Dr. Anthony says that the use of an axe would fit in with the injuries. She also testified that Martin was most likely completely unaware of the attack and had been attacked from behind. Martin presented with sharp and blunt force trauma involving the head and upper back, consisting of 4 lacerations and incised wounds. All the wounds were potentially fatal except for the incised wound on the upper back at the junction of the neck. A considerable amount of force was required to cause the injuries and the skull fracture. Dr. Anthony was of the opinion that the trauma was most likely inflicted from behind. She based her opinion on the location of the wounds, as well as the fact that no evidence of protecting vital parts could be found on Martin's body. Teresa had a chop wound or laceration that had split into 2 wounds, involving the right side of the top aspect of the scalp. Dr. Anthony was of the opinion that a heavy, bulky object moving with a tremendous amount of force and a high rate of speed had been used. Teresa also had an incised wound to the right front middle aspect of the scalp. Both wounds were potentially fatal. There was evidence of skull fractures and brain injury. Furthermore, she presented with abrasions on the nose bridge and contusions on her back. An incised wound on the inner side of the right thumb is suggestive of a defensive wound caused by a sharp object, indicating that Teresa faced the assailant, and was also aware of the infliction of the trauma. A report from the doctor who treated Madly said she had 5 deep lacerations to her head, with brain tissue visible, 4 lacerations to the left side, and 1 laceration more to the right. She had a deep laceration to her left ear that was partly severed from her head, and another deep laceration to the left side of her neck. Furthermore, Madly sustained a wound to the inside of her left lower arm, as well as bruising and an abrasion to her right hand. According to Dr. Small-Smith, the injuries presented by Madly are not only potentially fatal, they are in fact usually fatal. He confirmed that Madly's prognosis upon admission was really poor, and that the injuries fit in with infliction of a sharp instrument, like an axe. The injuries of the deceased were mainly confined to the head. Rudy suffered the most violent attack in terms of the number of injuries. Second was Martin, and then Teresa with lesser injuries. Dr. Anthony testified that Madly's injuries to her head and neck were consistent with the injuries sustained by the other 3 deceased family members. Injuries involving her hands and extremities were indicative of self-defensive wounds, and were multiple in origin, indicative of a severe scuffling. Considering the seriousness and the number of head injuries, the location of the wounds, and the considerable amount of force with which they were inflicted, there can be no doubt that the attacker had the intention to kill all the deceased, and Mudley. Dr. Anthony testified that the traumatic head injury had a very high mortality rate. Henry conceded during cross-examination that the intent was to kill if a person hit someone over the head with an axe. Defense counsel rightfully conceded that Mudley's injuries were life-threatening, and were inflicted with the intention to kill her. In comparison, Henry had a reasonably large knob on the left side of his head, and a swelling under his left eye, as well as superficial cuts and a minor stab wound. On the day of the murders at about 10:30 a.m., Dr. Alberter examined Henry as a victim. Dr. Alberter recorded the injuries sustained by Henry, which detailed 4 very superficial, parallel cuts on his left forearm, 2 above his right nipple and another above that, a superficial stab wound to the left thorax, and 1 superficial cut above his left nipple, and 2 stab wounds to the left abdominal area. Most of the injuries on the front of his body and forearm broke skin. On his back, he had a scratch on the left side of his back up over the scapula, and a scratch on the right side of his back under the scapula. These scratches did not break the skin. He had 2 abrasions on his back. There was old scarring on his right knee, a bruise and swelling just below it, and another 2 old bruises. He had swelling above his left eye and a bruise underneath it. Dr. Alberter testified that she did not regard his injuries as serious. The cut marks on the chest were superficial and non-fatal. Incisions had an equal depth, were parallel, and avoided sensitive areas like the nipples. The chest injuries were an reachable area for self-infliction. The forearm wounds were also in keeping with self-inflicted injuries, non-lethal, superficial, of an equal depth, and parallel cuts. It was highly unlikely for a victim who was being attacked with an axe to stand still or not take evasive actions to allow such multiple and uniform injuries to be executed. The incisions were on the left forearm, and Henry was reportedly right-handed. It was not a typical area where one would expect defense wounds with a sharp instrument. Defense wounds were most likely found on the ventral palmar aspect of the forearm or wrist, elbows, or palmar surface of the hand in a grasping motion in an attempt to grab the weapon, or on the backs of the hands or fingers from non-grasping movements in attempts to ward off a weapon. The forearm injuries were in reachable areas for being self-inflicted. Therefore, the injuries to the forearm as well as the cuts to the chest were consistent with being self-inflicted, while the other injuries were less likely to be so. The sharp force injuries to the thorax and abdomen had a slightly different appearance, and it seemed that they had been inflicted with a stabbing action versus a slicing action. These wounds were still superficial, with one bigger stab wound having a depth of approximately 10 millimeters. Judging the shape and size of the knife, it was possible for the knife to have been stuck in any of the stab wounds. On the stab wounds, she was of the opinion that they were superficial and non-fatal. None showed any characteristics that it was inflicted with the same intent or force as the deceased wounds. The rest of the family had extensive wounds caused by an axe, with underlying skull fractures. Henry had no defensive wounds one would have expected, if another party was present.
What was it about those wounds that ultimately said to you, yes, Henry van Breda has done this to himself?
They were all very superficial. They barely broke the skin. They were uniform, so they were similar in nature. They had a similar appearance. It looked as if it could have been inflicted with the same weapon. So you can see the bandage. It's not blood-soaked.
Henry's injuries were analysed by forensic pathologist Dr. Marianne Temensma.
You know, if you think you were just involved in an altercation, a physical fight, a struggle for life and death, you know, people holding onto each other, you would maybe expect to see bruises around the forearms, around the upper arm, as you're pulling and pushing, but nothing.
So
yes.
for Henry to get away with this...
No, as you say, he must be the luckiest man alive.
Ultimately, evidence found that Henry was standing next to Rudy's bed when he was attacked on his bed. Impact spatter patterns and cast-off patterns indicated that Rudy was attacked on his bed whilst lying on his stomach, with his head facing the adjacent wall. Martin's injuries to the back of his head and neck indicated that he was most probably attending to his son, Rudy, on the bed when he was attacked by the attacker on Rudy's bed. Blood spatter also indicated that the attacker was standing in the vicinity of Rudy's bed when Martin was attacked on Rudy's bed. Teresa was most probably attacked in the doorway of the first bedroom whilst facing her attacker, while Madly sustained her injuries during the confrontation with the attacker, most likely in the same area as Teresa. Madly sustained one laceration to her left lower arm, which might suggest a defensive position when sustaining the injury. The injury might also suggest that she had time to react to the assailant's attack. The The court summarized that the bloodstain patterns observed do not support the sequence of events presented by Henry in his statement.
The position of Henry van Breda during the events within his bedroom is inconsistent and is not supported with the spatter bloodstains observed and documented on grey short inter alia mark exhibit 120 and pair of white socks inter alia mark exhibit 119, which he had on during the incident. The spatter bloodstains observed and documented place Henry van Breda in close proximity of blood sources of Rudy and Martin when force was applied to blood sources of the victims. The events surrounding the confrontation following the suspect falling and fainting on the staircase presented by Henry van Breda in his statement is inconsistent with the flow patterns identified on his chest and left arm of Henry van Breda, which also suggests minimal to no movement of the upper chest and left arm of Henry van Breda after sustaining his injuries.
The events involving the knife are inconsistent with the events identified through bloodstain pattern analysis and the law of superposition. Henry's position during the events within the bedroom were inconsistent and not supported by the bloodstains on his shorts and socks, which he had on during the incident. The spatter bloodstains observed and documented placed Henry in close proximity to the blood sources of Rudy, Martin and Teresa when force was applied to those blood sources. So, the evidence was painting a pretty different picture to Henry's statement at this point. Extensive investigation found no fingerprints or proof of activity on the wall around the house, or on the black side gate next to the house. In Henry's version of events, the alleged intruder wore gloves, so no one would expect to find his fingerprints at the scene in any case. If the intruder had indeed been accompanied by a second person, the latter would probably have worn gloves as well, taking into consideration the dress code modus operandi of the perpetrators. Sergeant Oliphant collected the axe and the knife from the scene, and examined them for fingerprints. No fingerprints could be found on the axe. It is possible to get fingerprints on wood, depending on the surface, but it is not unusual to not find any. The test performed to identify fingerprints had no effect on other further forensic tests. Defense counsel suggested that if Henry had handled the axe, one would have expected to find a print. The witness furnished an explanation pertaining to protective gear that could have been worn. The witness also testified that if fingerprints were wiped off, they would not be found, even if the person did handle the axe over a long period of time. The bottom line is that Henry himself admitted handling the axe without protective gear during the altercation with the alleged intruder, and when he threw the axe at the alleged intruder. Despite this admission, Henry's fingerprints were not found on the axe. Sergeant Oliphant testified that 3 prints were found on the knife, of which 2 were identifiable. Henry's right thumbprint was found on the blade, 5 or 6 centimeters from the tip of the knife. The print pointed towards the handle of the knife. The identifiable print on the tip of the blade belonging to Henry was actually a double print, and it was indicated with circles by the witness. The bottom line is that it's unlikely that an intruder would have left fingerprints with gloved hands. Only Henry's thumbprint and Rudy's DNA were found on the knife. If there was no intruder, the knife could possibly have been used in a fight by the members of the family, amongst themselves at some stage during the course of the evening, or simply by Henry to stage his wounds and the scene. After a long and arduous trial, the court found no credible convincing evidence that an intruder had entered the estate and the Van Breda residence the night of the murders. Taking into account the type of weapon, the number and the nature of injuries, the perpetrator had to have had the intention to kill the victims. While Henry appeared confident during his quite apparently well-rehearsed testimony, he was much more uncomfortable during cross-examination. His answers were vague on difficult issues, whereas he gave detailed versions on other aspects. He tended to adjust his answers very subtly and contradicted himself in the process. His standard answer to difficult questions implicating him as the perpetrator amounted often to uninformative answers like, "I should have," without explaining the issue at hand sensibly and adequately. The court relied on the following objective facts to establish that Henry was indeed the perpetrator. The victims lived in a security estate with no evidence of any unlawful entry to the estate at the time of the incident. Though not impenetrable, a reasonably high degree of skill, knowledge of the layout of the estate and its security system, and of course some expertise in planning was required to unlawfully enter the premises. Fortuitous unlawful entry was most unlikely. No evidence of a typical house robbery or break-in, showing that the intruders had been inside the house, is evident. 4 of the 5 family members were found brutally attacked in a similar fashion and left for dead. The family members were all in very close proximity in the sleeping quarters of the house. Henry, however, was left standing, having lived through the events. Henry presented with injuries supposedly inflicted by the same attacker during the same incident and in execution of the same intent, yet markedly different in nature and extent to that of the rest of the family. The evidence establishes conclusively that some, if not all, of his injuries were self-inflicted. Henry's version provided of how the incident occurred is inconsistent with the objective evidence found on the scene. Henry amended material aspects of his version upon becoming aware of the irreconcilability of his version with the material aspects of the evidence. Each piece of evidence on its own might not be enough to establish the guilt of the accused, but the cumulative effect of all the pieces concludes the puzzle. With regard to his charge of defeating or obstructing the administration of justice, and the alleged staging of the scene by Henry by inflicting injuries to his person and hitting the axe into the wall above the staircase, the court finds that he had ample time during the 2-hour and 48-minute period to tamper with the scene, portraying him to be a victim and to be consistent with his innocence. Henry was the only person surviving a brutal encounter with minor injuries with intimate knowledge of the events. The court has no doubt that the injuries to the arm and chest of the accused were self-inflicted injuries for the compelling reasons advanced by the doctors who gave evidence. The accused deliberately committed positive acts of obstruction and supplied the police with false information that the police then acted upon by launching a search for the alleged intruder. He must have known that the allegations were false, and must have been aware of the fact that it might interfere with judicial proceedings, which were to take place in the future, or would at least hamper or forestall the investigation of the crimes. Considering this, the court found Henry guilty on all counts.
After considering all the evidence, the result is inescapable. As a family man, it's difficult for me to say so. It is the only possible inference. In the premises, count 1, the murder of Rudy van Breda, the accused is found guilty. Count 2, the murder of Martin van Breda, the accused is found guilty. Count 3, the murder of Teresa van Breda, the accused is found guilty. Count 4, the attempted murder of Maria van Breda, the accused is found guilty. Count 5, defeating or obstructing the administration of justice, the accused is found guilty. That is the unanimous decision of this court.